The battle for justice can be a long and painful road, especially when it seems like the scales are tipped in favor of those with power, money, and influence. In a world where exploitation is often cloaked in the mundane, housing discrimination remains one of the most pervasive forms of injustice. For countless individuals, a place to live is not just a roof over their heads. It's the foundation of their lives, their dreams, and their stability. But what happens when that foundation is threatened? When the landlord, who should be a steward of their home, becomes a predator, taking advantage of their tenants? This is the story of Lisa Johnson, a strong, determined Black woman who, like many others, found herself fighting not just for a roof over her head, but for the very dignity and rights that should be inherent in a democratic society. Lisa had always been a hard worker. Her job at the local nursing home kept her on her feet, but with 3 children to support and a rent that seemed to increase every year, life had become a constant struggle. Every month, she fought to balance the bills, make ends meet, and provide a safe, stable environment for her kids. The apartment she had rented for over 5 years was modest, but it was home, a place where her children could laugh, grow, and feel secure. But her landlord, Mr. Charles Green, saw tenants like Lisa as nothing more than a means to line his pockets. He was a man of privilege with connections in high places, and he exploited his tenants' desperation for his own gain. He had raised rent without notice, failed to make necessary repairs, and even attempted to evict tenants without just cause. Lisa had had enough. She tried to reach out to negotiate, but Mr. Green would only mock her efforts, dismissing her as just another struggling single mother. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. The tipping point came one cold November morning when Lisa found a notice on her door, an eviction notice. The reason? Unpaid rent. But Lisa knew that wasn't the truth. She had made partial payments, and the sudden eviction was nothing more than retaliation for her attempts to challenge his illegal practices. What followed was a whirlwind of legal paperwork, threats, and intimidation. Lisa wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her children and the community she called home. The stakes were high. If she lost, she would lose everything. But there was something else at play here. The odds were already stacked against her. Not only was Lisa Black, but she also faced a legal system that often failed to protect people like her. Housing discrimination, systemic racism, and the biases embedded in the courts meant that in many ways, her fight was not just against her landlord. It was against an entire system that had been designed to favor the powerful. Enter Judge Catherine Wilson, the white judge presiding over Lisa's case. Though her reputation as a fair and just judge had been established, the question lingered. Would she be able to set aside her own biases and rule impartially? Would Lisa's fight for justice be thwarted by the prejudices that so often plague the courts? Or would this be a case where the truth prevailed, no matter how uncomfortable it made those in power? As the courtroom battle loomed, tensions were high. Lisa knew that this wasn't just about a legal dispute. It was about survival, dignity, and proving that even in a system that wasn't built for her, she had the strength to rise above. What started as a fight for a roof over her head would soon become a fight for her place in a society that had long marginalized people like her. This was more than a case of a tenant versus a landlord. It was the story of a woman's unwavering resolve to stand up against injustice, no matter the cost. The odds were stacked against her, but Lisa was ready. And in the end, she would show that sometimes the most epic victories come from the most unexpected places. The conflict between Lisa Johnson and her landlord Charles Green was not born out of a single dispute, but rather from a long history of exploitation and disregard. It began innocuously enough. A slight increase in rent, a few small repairs that went ignored. But over time, Green's actions grew bolder, more brazen, and more damaging to Lisa's ability to live a stable life. What started as a nuisance became a full-blown crisis, affecting not just Lisa's financial stability, but her mental health, her family, and her future. It began with the rent increase. Every year, Green would send out a notice. Sometimes it was a letter in the mail. Other times it was slipped under the door with no warning. This year, it was a sharp 15% hike, well above the usual increase and certainly higher than the neighborhood average. Lisa had been paying her rent on time for years, But the sudden jump left her scrambling. Her wages hadn't risen in the same way. She worked hard as a nurse's aide, but the cost of living always seemed to outpace her income. And with 3 kids to care for, the rent increase was more than just an inconvenience. It was a threat to their home. Lisa tried to reason with Green. She called his office, asking to negotiate or at least discuss a reasonable payment plan. His response was cold and dismissive, as if he expected her to just accept it. When she sent a formal letter expressing her concern and outlining her difficulties, it was ignored. As the months went by, Lisa began to notice other troubling issues: leaky pipes, peeling paint, a broken oven that had been left unfixed for weeks. She was constantly calling the maintenance line, but there was no response. When she managed to reach someone, they promised repairs that never came. It felt like Green was deliberately neglecting the property, letting it deteriorate, knowing that the tenants would have no choice but to stay in substandard conditions because they couldn't afford to move. The final straw came when Lisa received the eviction notice. The letter claimed that she had failed to pay rent for 2 months, but that wasn't the case. Lisa had made partial payments, and she had saved every receipt to prove it. Green, however, wasn't interested in the facts. It seemed clear that this was a tactic to force her out, to get rid of a tenant who was questioning his authority, and to make way for higher-paying ones. The eviction notice wasn't just an attack on Lisa's finances. It felt like a personal affront. She had tried to follow the rules, to do things the right way, but it seemed that in this world, the rules didn't apply to people like her. She had spent hours trying to understand the legal jargon in the notice, to find any loophole that might save her from losing her home. But every effort felt like a dead end. The stress of it all weighed heavily on her, a single mother with 3 kids depending on her, caught in a system that was indifferent to her struggle. She was tired, emotionally drained, and starting to question if it was even worth fighting. But Lisa's resolve wasn't easily broken. Her children needed her, and she couldn't afford to let Green win. She began to reach out to community groups, to friends who had faced similar challenges, trying to find a way to push back against the unfair treatment. She attended local meetings and talked to others who had suffered at Green's hands. Many of them were scared to speak out, afraid of retaliation or losing their homes. But Lisa's bravery was contagious. Slowly, she found a few people who were willing to sign a petition to speak up about the mistreatment they had endured. With her courage restored, Lisa took the next step. She contacted a legal aid office and was assigned a lawyer who specialized in tenant rights. The lawyer explained the situation in simple terms. Lisa had a case, but the road ahead would be difficult. She would need to challenge Green in court, and the odds were stacked against her. There was the risk that Green, with his deep pockets, would outlast her in court. There was the reality that as a Black woman, Lisa might face bias from the legal system. The odds were not in her favor, but Lisa's determination was not swayed. Her first few visits to the courthouse were a whirlwind of confusion and intimidation. The building itself was cold and imposing, the halls filled with lawyers and officials who seemed to speak in a language she could barely understand. But Lisa pressed on, finding solace in the few supporters who showed up with her. She didn't know much about the legal system, but she knew right from wrong, and that was all that mattered. Green, on the other hand, was calm and collected, appearing to take everything in stride. His lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man, smiled condescendingly as they strolled past Lisa in the hallway. Green's arrogance was palpable. He knew that he was used to winning. He was the one with the money, the one with the power. Lisa was just a small, insignificant tenant, easy to push aside. And then there was the judge. Judge Catherine Wilson had a reputation for being fair, but Lisa couldn't shake the nagging doubt in her mind. How could a white judge understand the nuances of her situation? How could someone who had likely never faced the struggles she had know what it felt like to be on the receiving end of an unfair legal system? Still, Lisa refused to be intimidated. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been exploited, for every tenant who had been silenced. As the date of the trial approached, the tension between her and Green grew. Green's arrogance continued unabated, but Lisa was determined to see this through. The emotional and financial toll was enormous, but the fight was worth it. The day of the trial arrived, and Lisa sat in the courtroom, her heart racing. She had come this far, but she knew the hardest part was yet to come. Would the court recognize her struggle? Would it side with her against the greed and exploitation she had faced? The answer, she hoped, was still within reach. As the days leading up to the trial grew shorter, Lisa's resolve only deepened. She knew that to have any chance in court, she would need more than just her word against Green's. She needed solid evidence to back up her claims, irrefutable proof that Green had not only violated her rights, but had also exploited her and other tenants for far too long. Lisa began her investigation in the same way she had approached every challenge in her life, with tenacity. Armed with her smartphone and a notepad, she started by documenting every issue in her apartment that Green had ignored. She took photos of the leaking pipes in the kitchen, the cracked windows that let cold air seep in, the peeling paint and mold growing in the corners of her walls. The issues that Green had neglected for months were glaringly obvious. But for Lisa, taking the photos wasn't just about collecting evidence. It was about reclaiming her dignity. Each picture she snapped, each note she made, was an act of defiance, a reminder that she wasn't powerless, even if the system often made her feel that way. She also reached out to her neighbors, many of whom had been too afraid to speak out, either because they feared retaliation or because they didn't think anything would change. Lisa, however, had become the voice for those who had been silenced. She knocked on doors, talked to families, and asked them to stand with her. Some agreed, willing to risk the wrath of Green for the chance to put an end to his exploitation. Others shared their own stories of broken promises, rent hikes, and ignored complaints, giving Lisa ammunition for her case. She even managed to get a few of them to testify on her behalf, offering sworn affidavits about the poor conditions in the building and Green's repeated failures to make repairs. Despite the mounting evidence, the process wasn't easy. Lisa struggled with the legal jargon that seemed to flood every document. Her lawyer, an overworked but passionate legal aid attorney named Rebecca, was a constant source of guidance and support. Rebecca explained the intricacies of the law to Lisa, breaking down the terminology and helping her understand what was required for the case. It was a steep learning curve, but Lisa kept at it, poring over the lease agreement and even reviewing old emails and letters from Green. It was during one of these long nights that Lisa discovered a crucial detail buried deep in the lease agreement, a clause that, at first glance, seemed like a standard term, but upon further scrutiny, revealed something far more sinister. The clause gave Green the right to raise the rent at his discretion without any limit on how high it could go. This was illegal. In many states, there were rent control laws designed to protect tenants from unreasonable increases. Green had violated this law repeatedly, and Lisa now had concrete evidence to prove it. The discovery was a turning point. It wasn't just about poor living conditions anymore. Green had been breaking the law, and Lisa now had a smoking gun. With this newfound evidence in hand, Lisa's confidence grew. But it wasn't just about finding the right paperwork. She still had to contend with Green's relentless attempts to intimidate her. As the trial approached, he began using his power to pressure her in more subtle ways. He'd call her late at night, asking her why she was making things difficult, why she couldn't just pay the rent and avoid all this trouble. Sometimes he'd appear in the building's lobby, wearing a tight smile, asking her how she was holding up, as if he were the concerned landlord. But Lisa knew better. Every word, every gesture was designed to make her feel small, to make her doubt herself. At the same time, Green's legal team, composed of high-priced attorneys, began their own campaign of intimidation. They flooded Lisa's lawyer with motions, asking for every piece of information she had gathered. They even tried to have Lisa's evidence dismissed, arguing that the photos and testimonies she had collected were irrelevant or unreliable. But Rebecca fought back fiercely, demanding that the evidence be allowed to stand. The strategy was clear. Green's team was trying to overwhelm Lisa and her legal team to force them into submission. But Lisa wasn't backing down. The emotional toll of the case also weighed heavily on her. There were days when the weight of the legal process, combined with her family responsibilities, made her question whether she had the strength to continue. She had moments of doubt. Was she just a pawn in a larger game? Would the system ever truly work for someone like her? Lisa would sit in her living room, looking at her children, and wonder what kind of future they would have if she lost. She couldn't afford to fail them. Her fight was their fight, and she was determined to make sure they had a chance to live without fear. It wasn't until a breakthrough came from an unlikely source that Lisa's case truly gained momentum. A housing rights advocate named Maria, who had been following Lisa's case, offered her assistance. Maria had spent years helping tenants in similar situations, and her experience proved invaluable. She helped Lisa connect with a local tenants union that had been advocating for more tenant protections in the city. The union provided Lisa with expert witnesses, including an engineer who had inspected the property and verified the substandard conditions of the building. The engineer's report was detailed and professional, and it would be crucial in proving that Green's neglect wasn't just a series of isolated incidents, but a systemic failure to maintain his properties. As Lisa and her team prepared for trial, the pressure began to mount on Green. The discovery of the illegal rent clause, coupled with the mounting evidence of neglect, began to make him sweat. His demeanor shifted from confident and dismissive to increasingly agitated. He started making more frequent appearances at the courthouse, his posture stiffer, his attempts to manipulate the media more desperate. It was clear he hadn't anticipated this level of resistance, and the cracks in his facade were starting to show. In the courtroom, Judge Catherine Wilson had remained mostly neutral, offering little insight into where she stood. But even she couldn't ignore the mounting evidence against Green. Lisa's case had gone from a simple tenant dispute to a case of systemic exploitation, and it was becoming harder for anyone to deny the reality of what had been happening. The judge's gaze seemed to soften whenever Lisa presented new evidence, and her tone grew more pointed whenever Green's attorneys attempted to dismiss the facts. By the time the trial date arrived, the momentum had clearly shifted in Lisa's favor. She had become more than just a tenant seeking justice. She was a symbol of resistance, a force that was shaking the very foundations of the system that had allowed landlords like Green to thrive. And Green, despite all his wealth and influence, was beginning to realize that Lisa was not the easy target he had once thought her to be. The final court hearing was a culmination of months of preparation, stress, and personal sacrifice. The courtroom was tense, filled with anticipation, and the air thick with the gravity of the case. Lisa, dressed in a simple but sharp suit, sat at the plaintiff's table with her lawyer, Rebecca, by her side. Her heart raced, but she held her head high. She wasn't just a tenant today. She was a woman standing up for what was right, and she was determined to see this through. The room was quiet except for the soft shuffle of papers and the rhythmic ticking of the clock. Charles Green, dressed in a dark suit with a smug look plastered on his face, sat at the defendant's table, his lawyer by his side. Green had always exuded an air of superiority, but today there was something different in his posture, a slight rigidity, a tightness around his eyes, as if he was starting to realize that this fight might not go the way he had planned. Judge Catherine Wilson, a woman known for her calm demeanor and her reputation for fairness, took her seat at the bench. She glanced at both sides of the courtroom, her gaze moving between Lisa, Green, and their legal teams, but her expression remained unreadable. The silence hung heavily over the room, and Lisa could feel the weight of the judge's scrutiny. She had no way of knowing which way the judge's decision would swing, but she had a sinking feeling that, even with all the evidence stacked against Green, this could still go either way. The proceedings began, and the tension was palpable. Rebecca stood first, presenting the case in a clear, concise manner, walking the court through the illegal rent increases, the neglect of the property, and the emotional and financial toll that it had taken on Lisa and her family. She introduced the evidence, presenting the photos, the maintenance requests, the testimonies from Lisa's neighbors, and the report from the engineer who had inspected the building. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture of Green's actions. When it was Lisa's turn to testify, she took a deep breath and stood, walking slowly to the witness stand. Every step felt like a battle in itself, but as she sat down and looked out at the courtroom, she felt a wave of strength wash over her. This wasn't just a fight for her family anymore. It was a fight for every person who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or exploited. Lisa began by recounting her story, her struggle to make ends meet, her pride in being a good tenant, and her growing frustration with Green's actions. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, it steadied. She spoke with the quiet power of someone who had been pushed to her breaking point but refused to give in. She described the impact of the rent hikes, the failed promises of repairs, and the final, crushing blow of the eviction notice. She spoke of the sleepless nights, the worry she felt for her children, and the constant fear that she might lose her home. And then she spoke of her decision to fight back, of the moment when she realized that if she didn't stand up for herself, no one else would. "I didn't just want to keep a roof over my kids' heads," Lisa said, her voice firm. "I wanted to show them that when someone tries to take everything from you, you don't just sit back and accept it. You fight. You fight for your rights, for your dignity, for the future." As she spoke, the room seemed to hold its breath. There was a vulnerability in her words, but there was also a fire that burned in her chest and lit up the entire courtroom. The audience, which had been quietly listening, leaned in, and even Green's lawyer seemed to have momentarily lost his arrogance. The weight of Lisa's testimony settled over the room, and for a brief moment, it was clear that her fight was not just personal. It was a fight that resonated with everyone present. Green's defense was predictable. He took the stand with his usual smugness, denying any wrongdoing and attempting to deflect blame. He claimed that the rent increases were simply part of a business model, that he had tried to maintain the property as best as he could, and that Lisa's claims were exaggerated. He dismissed the testimonies of the other tenants, suggesting that they were motivated by personal grievances or false narratives. His arrogance filled the room, his every word dripping with entitlement. But the longer he spoke, the more transparent his lies became. His tone was defensive, and his claims seemed increasingly hollow as the evidence piled up against him. Even Judge Wilson remained impassive, her expression unreadable. But Lisa could sense a shift in the atmosphere. The judge was listening, really listening, and Green's attempts to twist the facts were falling flat. The turning point came when Rebecca introduced one final piece of evidence, a recording from a conversation between Green and Lisa. In it, Green's voice was unmistakable as he threatened Lisa, telling her that if she didn't accept the rent increase, she would find herself out on the street. The recording was a smoking gun, a clear admission of his intent to manipulate and intimidate his tenants. As the recording played, the courtroom was dead silent. Green's face turned a shade of crimson, and for the first time, he seemed genuinely rattled. His lawyer tried to object, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The evidence was irrefutable, and Lisa's determination had exposed the truth. Now all that was left was the verdict. Judge Wilson called the court to order. She glanced once more at the evidence, her fingers lightly resting on the papers in front of her. She looked up, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. Lisa sat on the edge of her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. Green, on the other hand, sat back with his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. And then the judge spoke. "After reviewing the evidence presented, it is clear that Charles Green has violated the rights of his tenant, Lisa Johnson. The evidence of neglect, unlawful rent increases, and intimidation is overwhelming. Not only has Mr. Green failed to provide safe living conditions, but his actions have also been a direct violation of tenant rights and the law." The words hung in the air, and Lisa could hardly believe what she was hearing. The judge wasn't finished. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Lisa Johnson. Mr. Green is ordered to cease all eviction proceedings and to make immediate reparations to Ms. Johnson for damages, including compensation for the emotional and financial hardship she has endured. Further, this court strongly condemns the unethical practices exhibited by Mr. Green, and I urge all landlords in this district to take heed. Exploitation of tenants will not be tolerated." A wave of disbelief and relief washed over Lisa. She had won. Her heart swelled as she realized that her fight had not only been about her. She had just stood up for every tenant who had been treated like a second-class citizen. Green, meanwhile, was visibly stunned. His face drained of color, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled to gather his papers. He had never expected this outcome. The humiliation was written all over his face. He had been bested not by the law, but by the courage of one woman who refused to be intimidated. As Lisa walked out of the courtroom, her chest lifted with pride. The fight had been long, and it had been hard, but in that moment, she felt like she had not only reclaimed her home, but had also set a precedent for others who would come after her. She was no longer just a tenant. She was a symbol of resilience, a woman who had taken on a system designed to crush her and emerged victorious. And as the courtroom doors closed behind her, Lisa Johnson knew that her victory wasn't just her own. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they were powerless. The months that followed the trial were a whirlwind of change. For Lisa Johnson, the victory was not just about the legal ruling. It was about reclaiming control over her life, her future, and her sense of dignity. The decision in her favor had sparked something deeper than just personal relief. It had ignited a fire of hope and change that reverberated far beyond the courtroom. Initially, Lisa's life seemed to stabilize. The pressure of the impending eviction lifted, and she was able to focus on her family. She was finally able to make the repairs in her apartment that had been long neglected. With the compensation awarded to her for damages, she fixed the broken windows, replaced the faulty plumbing, and gave her children a home they could feel proud of. The sense of relief was palpable. No more uncertainty, no more sleepless nights wondering whether they would have to pack up and leave everything behind. But the changes were not just physical. Lisa's newfound stability allowed her to dream again. For the first time in a long while, she could picture a future where she and her children could thrive, free from the constant fear of exploitation. With the emotional weight of the legal battle behind her, Lisa was able to invest more time in her community. She became a vocal advocate for tenant rights, speaking at local meetings, working with housing organizations, and even mentoring others who found themselves in similar situations. Her victory was a testament to the power of one person's voice, how a single act of defiance can ripple out, touching lives and inspiring others to speak up. Word of Lisa's victory spread quickly throughout the community. Her neighbors, many of whom had once feared Green's wrath, began to see her as a beacon of hope. Some started standing up to their own landlords, armed with the knowledge that they, too, had rights. Others, emboldened by Lisa's courage, began to organize and demand better living conditions, fairer treatment, and accountability from their landlords. Lisa had not just won a court case, she had sparked a movement. The case also attracted the attention of local media outlets, who ran feature stories on her fight for justice. Her face appeared in the news not as a victim, but as a hero, someone who had taken on the system and won. This public recognition not only gave Lisa the validation she deserved, but it also shone a light on the broader issues of housing discrimination and the rampant exploitation of tenants in the area. Her story became a rallying cry for others facing similar battles, and her name became synonymous with resilience in the fight against injustice. In the legal world, Lisa's case sent shockwaves through the community of housing law. The precedent set by the verdict was not just a win for one tenant, it was a call to action for lawmakers and legal professionals alike. The ruling prompted discussions about housing reforms and the need for stronger protections for tenants, especially in low-income communities. Advocacy groups, bolstered by Lisa's success, lobbied for better enforcement of tenant rights laws, calling for stricter penalties for landlords who engaged in predatory practices. A year after the verdict, there were signs of tangible change. Local ordinances were revised to provide clearer and more robust protections for tenants facing eviction and neglect. The case served as a reminder that even the most entrenched systems of exploitation could be challenged, and that the law, when applied fairly, could serve as a powerful tool for justice. Lisa's case had begun a ripple effect that would reach across the city, inspiring lawmakers to take a harder look at how tenants were treated and whether the laws were truly serving their needs. As for Lisa, her journey was far from over. She was invited to speak at conferences, participate in panel discussions, and work with advocacy groups pushing for broader change. She traveled across the state, sharing her story with others who felt powerless in the face of injustice, encouraging them to stand firm and fight back. Though her victory had been monumental, she never lost sight of the bigger picture. The fight for housing equality, the fight for dignity, and the fight for the rights of those who had no voice. Lisa's work was only just beginning. The impact of her victory was also deeply personal. Lisa's family life flourished. Her children, who had seen their mother struggle, were now growing up with a newfound sense of security and pride. They watched as Lisa not only rebuilt their home, but also rebuilt her own sense of self-worth. They saw firsthand how one person's courage could change everything. For Lisa, there were moments of reflection in the quiet evenings when she sat with her children, watching them laugh and play, free from the weight of worry. She thought back to those long, dark nights when it seemed like the world was against her, when Green's threats felt like they would swallow her whole. But then she remembered the moment she stepped into the courtroom, the moment she found her voice. She remembered how far she had come and how she had never backed down. "I never thought it would come to this," she said one evening as she sat with Rebecca and Maria, two of the women who had supported her throughout the case. "But now I see that this wasn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been ignored, silenced, or taken advantage of. We all have the right to stand up for ourselves. We all deserve a voice." Rebecca, who had become not just her lawyer, but a close friend, nodded. "Your case changed more than just the outcome for you, Lisa. It changed the way people see themselves in this system. And that's something no one can ever take away from you." Even Judge Catherine Wilson, who had presided over the case, took the time to reflect on the significance of the verdict. In a public statement, she expressed her admiration for Lisa's perseverance and courage, calling the case a clear example of why the law must always serve the people it was designed to protect. The judge's comments helped reinforce the power of the legal system when used in service of justice. And as the years passed, Lisa's story continued to resonate, reminding everyone who heard it that the pursuit of justice is not just about winning a case. It's about standing firm in the face of adversity, challenging what's wrong, and creating change for the generations that come after. The victory in the courtroom was just the beginning of something much larger. In the end, the true impact of Lisa's battle wasn't just the legal victory. It was the spark of transformation it ignited. It was a reminder that even the smallest act of resistance can ripple outward, inspiring others to stand up, speak out, and demand what is rightfully theirs. It was a call to action for anyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of injustice, urging them to find their own strength, to fight for what they deserve, and to never stop believing that change is possible. As the final credits rolled on the story of Lisa Johnson, the message was clear. Justice, when it is pursued with courage and determination, can change lives, not just for the person who wins, but for an entire community, an entire system. And in this fight for justice, there is always room for hope.